Jada sat on her bed, the journal in front of her, the pen trembling slightly in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind, a constant battle between the fear of being misunderstood and the growing need to speak out. The ink on the paper was only a fraction of the weight she carried in her chest, the weight of being the only one who dared to challenge the very system that had always been stacked against her. Jada's voice, V.O. Am I just too much? Is it wrong to want more? To want justice? I've been told so many times to just keep my head down, to play it safe. But when I do, it feels like I'm suffocating. I can't stay quiet. Not when I know what's wrong. But what if they're right? What if I'm just trouble? She stopped writing and stared at the page as if the words would somehow leap off the paper and answer her questions. The silence in her room felt thick, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. Her thoughts, once filled with dreams of becoming a lawyer, now seemed like they were spiraling into a series of impossible obstacles. The door creaked open and her mother, Denise, stepped in, her face a mix of concern and understanding. She knew that look, knew it all too well. Denise had seen her daughter go through this before. The fear of being too loud, too bold, too unapologetically herself. Denise, Jada, baby, what's on your mind? You've been in here all day. Jada didn't answer immediately. She just shook her head, the weight of her doubts too heavy to put into words. Instead, she turned to her mother, the woman who had taught her everything about resilience and standing up for herself, even when the world didn't seem to care. Jada, I don't know, Mom. I just keep thinking maybe I'm making it worse. What if everyone's right? What if fighting back only makes things harder? Denise walked over to her daughter and sat beside her on the bed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The gesture was warm, steady, something to ground Jada in the storm of emotions she was facing. Denise, sweetheart, you're not making it worse. What you're doing is hard, but it's necessary. And I know it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, but you've got to understand. This fight isn't just about you. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed and overlooked because of who they are. Jada let out a shaky breath, her mind racing as she processed her mother's words. The comfort in Denise's voice was a lifeline, but the fear was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind. Jada, but I'm scared. I don't know if I can keep going. People are calling me all sorts of things, rebellious, too radical, too angry. And sometimes I start to wonder if they're right. Denise held her daughter's gaze, her eyes filled with wisdom and love. She knew Jada's heart, knew the strength that had always been there, even when Jada couldn't see it herself. The world will try to label you, try to make you feel small, but you don't have to fit into their boxes. You're not here to make them comfortable. You're here to make change. Change is messy, and it's never easy. But it's always worth it. Jada looked down at the journal in her lap, the page still blank, the weight of her thoughts still pressing down on her. She felt small in the face of it all, like a single voice against a tidal wave of indifference and fear. But as her mother's words sunk in, a flicker of something else ignited within her, something stronger than the fear. Jada, I don't want to be just another person who stays quiet. I want to make a difference. I just don't know if I can keep fighting, Mom. It feels like I'm alone in this. Denise smiled softly, squeezing Jada's shoulder in a quiet, comforting gesture. Denise, you're not alone. You never have been. Your father always said the right fight is never the easiest one. He fought for what was right even when it meant losing everything. And you, Jada, you've got that same fire in you. You've always had it. Jada closed her eyes for a moment, letting her mother's words wash over her. Her father, she could still hear his voice in her head, echoing the same words Denise had spoken. His memory had always been a source of strength for her, even if she didn't fully understand the sacrifices he had made. But now, in this moment of doubt, his legacy felt like a calling she couldn't ignore. Jada, I don't want to disappoint him. I don't want to disappoint you either. Denise brushed a stray curl from Jada's forehead, her voice soft yet firm. Denise, you'll never disappoint me, Jada. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been told they're not enough. And in the end, that's all that matters. Your voice is powerful. Don't let anyone tell you it's not. Jada took a deep breath, a sense of clarity starting to form amidst the swirling chaos in her mind. She picked up the pen again, her hand steadier now. She wasn't done. She wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Jada's voice, VO. I am not just trouble. I am a voice that demands to be heard, and I will fight, not because it's easy, but because it's the right thing to do. She began to write, her words flowing onto the page, each sentence a declaration of resilience, of defiance. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Jada sat alone in her room, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her journal lay open before her, the pages filled with scattered thoughts, frustrations, and questions she couldn't seem to answer. She picked up her pen, hesitated for a moment, and then began to write again. I don't know what's happening to me. It feels like I'm drowning in this fight. Every time I think I've made a difference, another wall goes up. Another person tells me I'm wrong. For standing up, for trying to be heard. Her pen shook slightly as she continued, the words coming faster now, a reflection of the chaos inside her. She wanted to let it all out. She wanted someone to understand, someone who wouldn't dismiss her as just another angry black girl. I tried to do it the right way. I followed the rules, I kept my head down, but every time I speak out, it's like they treat me like I'm some kind of problem, like my skin's the problem. She paused, staring at the sentence. Was it too much? Was she exaggerating? Maybe they were right. Maybe it was better to just be quiet, to not stir things up. The idea of being a problem haunted her. Was it true? Were they just going to label her as trouble forever? Jada closed her journal and leaned back in her chair. The weight of the silence in her room pressed down on her, and the weight of the world outside it made her feel even smaller. She knew she couldn't stop. But sometimes it was so hard to keep going. Later that week, Jada sat in the school cafeteria. Her tray barely touched. Her friends had been quiet lately. Maya, the one person who'd always been there, was sitting across from her, but there was a distance in her eyes. She wasn't speaking much. The tension in the air was thick. Hey, Maya said after a long silence, her voice low. I've been thinking, maybe we should just let it go. Just this once, you know? Maybe it's not worth fighting them. It's hard, Jada, and I hate seeing you hurt. Jada's heart sank. She looked at Maya, her best friend, the one person who had always stood by her. But even Maya seemed to be backing away. Her words were like ice, and Jada's hands clenched tightly around her tray, her nails digging into the plastic. Let it go? Jada's voice cracked, the bitterness slipping out before she could stop it. Let it go, Maya. Do you know what that means? Letting them win. Letting them tell me I don't belong here, that my voice doesn't matter, that I'm nothing more than trouble. Maya looked down, her face flushed. I'm not saying that. Jada, I don't want to see you break. This whole thing, it's bigger than what we can handle. Jada felt a lump in her throat, a mix of hurt and disbelief. Her chest tightened. She knew Maya wasn't trying to hurt her, but it still felt like betrayal. The very people she thought would fight beside her were now hesitating. I don't have a choice, Maya. This isn't just about me. This is about every student of color who's been ignored or punished or thrown aside because of who they are. She took a shaky breath. I can't stop. Not now. Not when I know I'm right. The days after that conversation only made Jada feel more isolated. At school, people began to avoid her. She overheard whispers in the hallways, students muttering. Things like, there goes the troublemaker, or why can't she just move on? Even teachers who used to smile at her in the hallways now looked away. She could feel the shift, the coolness in the air. It was as if she had become an outcast in her own school, a place she had worked so hard to belong. And yet, every time, The doubt crept in. Jada heard her mother's voice in her head. Don't you dare quit, Jada. You are stronger than they can ever make you believe. Justice doesn't come easy, baby. It's a long road, but you are not alone on it. Jada closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. She could feel the sting of betrayal from her friends, the weight of the isolation she was enduring, but there was a spark inside her that wouldn't die. She wouldn't let it. It wasn't just about being right anymore. It was about something deeper, fighting for every person who had been silenced before her, fighting for the ones who would come after her. The legal battle felt like a never-ending storm. Each day was more exhausting than the last. Jada, her mother, and their lawyer sat in meeting after meeting, reviewing documents, preparing arguments, but it never seemed to make any progress. The courtrooms felt cold, distant, like they didn't even care about what was at stake. Every time they were turned down, Jada's frustration boiled over. Every setback felt like another brick added to the wall that kept her from being heard. One afternoon, after another rejection, Jada collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not when she was so close. Why does it have to be like this, Mom? She whispered, her voice muffled. Why does it feel like I'm fighting a fight I'll never win? Her mother, standing in the doorway, didn't say anything for a moment. She simply came over, sitting on the edge of the bed and placing a gentle hand on Jada's back. Because the world has always been like this, baby. But you're going to change that. You're going to show them that you won't back down no matter what they throw at you. Jada looked up at her mother, wiping her eyes. I don't feel strong, Mom. I feel so alone. Like no one understands. Like I'm the only one fighting. Her mother smiled softly. You are not alone. You never were. Even when it feels like no one's with you, remember that you stand for something bigger than yourself. You're not just fighting for you. You're fighting for every person who has been told they don't belong. You're fighting for them, too. Jada nodded, a spark of determination reigniting inside her. Her fight was far from over. She had a long road ahead, but she wouldn't walk it alone. She couldn't. Jada sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her face. The cursor blinked on a blank document, but it felt as though the words weren't coming to her. She had been staring at the screen for hours, the pressure mounting, with each passing minute. She was used to the silence that followed a controversial post, but this felt different. The weight of what she was about to say weighed on her chest, heavier than it ever had before. She knew the risks. She knew the backlash was coming. But it didn't matter. What mattered was getting her message out. It mattered that she spoke her truth. Jada took a deep breath and began typing. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every student who's been overlooked, dismissed, or punished for things that others get away with. I'm fighting for the ones who are scared to speak up, for the ones who have been made to feel like their voices don't matter. They do. I do. And we won't stay silent any longer. She hit post. Instantly, the comments started flooding, in both positive and negative. Some of her peers praised her bravery, others called her radical, playing the race card, trying to stir up unnecessary trouble. But amidst the hate, something began to shift. People were listening, and for the first time, Jada felt the power of her own voice. The next day, Jada walked through the halls with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about survival anymore. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was an activist, a voice for those who felt silenced. Her presence, once barely noticed, now seemed to command attention. Eyes followed her. Whispers followed her. Some of it was admiration, some of it was criticism. But it didn't matter. Jada knew that what she was doing wasn't just about her. It was bigger than her. She was a part of something that couldn't be ignored. In class, Jada's thoughts often drifted, her mind consumed by the ripple effect of her actions. She could feel it in the air. Students were starting to talk. A few had come up to her after class, telling her how they supported her, how they were inspired by her bravery. Maya, too, had become more vocal, her hesitation slowly transforming into determination. You're right, Jada, Maya said one afternoon after class, her voice filled with newfound resolve. I was scared before. Scared of what people would say, scared of the backlash, but I can't keep quiet anymore. I'm with you. We're in this together. Jada's heart swelled with gratitude. Her best friend had found her courage. But it wasn't just Maya. As the days passed, more students, black and non-black, came forward, expressing their support. They were ready to stand with her. But with the rising support came an equally powerful backlash. The town began to divide even further, and the whispers turned into open accusations. Jada could feel the hostility intensifying. The community called her a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser, someone who didn't know her place. They just want to make it about race, some said. This isn't about inequality. It's just an excuse for attention. Jada felt the sting of their words, each one like a slap in the face. But every insult, every accusation only made her resolve stronger. She was doing the right thing, even if it didn't feel that way in the moment. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Don't let them define you, Jada. You are the one writing this story. And write it, she did. A week later, Jada stood before the town council. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited her turn to speak. The room was filled with people, some supportive, some skeptical, some downright hostile. But Jada was determined. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been told to stay quiet. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Some were angry, some were hopeful. But she didn't let the fear consume her. Not anymore. I'm here today, Jada began, her voice steady, because I believe in justice, I believe in fairness, and I believe that our school, our community, can be better than this. I believe that every student, no matter their race, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. But right now, we are failing. We are failing the students who are punished for speaking out. We are failing the students who are made to feel invisible. I'm here today not just for myself, but for every student who has been silenced. I'm here for those who don't have the courage to speak, but who are just as hurt, just as angry. I'm here to say that we are more than the labels you try to put on us. We are more than your prejudices. Jada paused, the room silent now. She could feel the weight of the moment, the energy in the air shifting. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. I am not your problem, she continued, her voice growing stronger. The problem is the system that keeps us down. The problem is the racism that is embedded in our institutions, in our schools, in our laws. But we are not powerless. We can change this, but only if we stand together. She could see the reaction in the crowd. Some faces were hard, defiant. Others were thoughtful, reflective. And for the first time, Jada felt like she was making a real impact. The council meeting was a turning point. Jada's speech reverberated throughout the town, sparking discussions in homes, schools, and workplaces. Her message was clear. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about a community that needed to wake up to the injustices it had been ignoring for far too long. But the backlash didn't stop. The accusations grew louder. People began to question Jada's motives, accusing her of stirring up division, of creating problems where none existed. But Jada remained resolute. She had become a symbol of resistance, and no matter how hard they tried to tear her down, she wasn't going anywhere. As the weeks passed, Jada organized a peaceful protest outside the school demanding justice. It wasn't just about the expulsion anymore. It was about the systemic racism that had permeated every aspect of her life. And she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The protest became a defining moment in her journey. People from all walks of life came together, united by a common cause. The students, the parents, the activists. Jada had sparked something that couldn't be put out. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever fought for justice, for equality, for the right to be seen. Jada wasn't just an individual anymore. She was a movement, a force for change. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, She knew one thing for sure. She wasn't fighting alone. Her voice, once barely a whisper, had become a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. The protests outside the school grew in size over the next few weeks. What started as a handful of passionate students soon transformed into a movement. More voices were joining, some students from different schools, local community leaders, and parents who were fed up with the injustices their children were facing. Jada felt a surge of pride every time she saw new faces, every time someone stepped forward and added their voice to the chorus calling for change. But with the rise of support came more hate, more accusations, and more tension in the community. People who had once smiled at Jada in the halls now avoided her gaze, or worse, gave her the cold shoulder. There were whispers in the classrooms, in the streets, in the grocery store. Some people, many of them white, felt threatened by the spotlight that was now on their town. They feared that the racial divide, once hidden under the surface, would be exposed for all to see. Jada had heard it all. She's just causing trouble. She's going to ruin the reputation of this school. Why doesn't she just leave? But every time someone tried to diminish her, Jada thought of her mother, Denise, and the words of her late father, the man who had always taught her to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. She couldn't give up now. One evening, after a long day of speaking with lawyers and organizing protests, Jada sat alone in her room, exhausted. Her phone buzzed on the bed and she picked it up to find a message from Maya. "I know you're tired, but we're with you. Don't let them break you. We need you." Jada's heart ached. She had been leaning on Maya more than ever these days. She had tried to keep up the facade that she was strong, that nothing could break her. But deep down, she was starting to feel the toll it was taking on her. She typed back quickly, "I'm scared, Maya. I'm scared I'm losing people. Scared they'll never see what I'm trying to do. It feels like no matter how hard I fight, I'm never going to win." A long pause before Maya's reply. "I get it. I'm scared too. But the fight is worth it. You're worth it. The truth is on your side, Jada. Keep going. We're all in this together." Jada smiled softly at her phone, taking a deep breath. She had no choice but to keep going. The movement she had started wasn't just for her. It was for every student who had been silenced, for every person who had been treated as less than, for every parent who had watched their child suffer under a system that was never built for them. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battle for her expulsion raged on. Each court date was another uphill battle, another exhausting reminder of how deeply embedded the racism was in every corner of her life. The courtrooms were cold, sterile, and felt alien to her. The lawyers on the other side seemed more interested in discrediting her than actually listening to her. They brought up her behavior, twisted her words, and painted her as a troublemaker. But Jada stood tall. Every time they tried to break her, she remembered what her mother had said. The truth is more powerful than any lie they try to tell. Don't let them take away your voice. She could feel it now, the weight of her voice, the weight of the truth. The more they tried to suppress her, the louder she became. And the louder she became, the more people began to listen. The turning point came one evening when Jada was invited to a local town hall meeting. The meeting had been called in response to the protests, and the school board was expected to make a statement. Principal Collins, who had been the driving force behind Jada's expulsion, was also scheduled to speak. Jada had no idea what to expect. She had been to enough of these meetings to know how they usually went. Nothing ever really changed. But she also knew that this time, it would be different. She was no longer just a student fighting for her right to an education. She was a leader, a voice for the voiceless. As the meeting began, the room buzzed with tension. Jada sat in the way back, her heart racing. She could see Principal Collins sitting at the front, his usual smug composure slightly shaken. He had been under fire for weeks, and Jada could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. When it was her turn to speak, Jada stood slowly, walking to the podium. The murmurs in the room quieted as she began. "I'm here tonight," she said, her voice unwavering. Because I believe in justice. I believe that no student, no matter their race, should ever have to fight to be heard, to be seen, to be treated equally. But that's exactly what I've had to do. I've had to fight every single day for the right to be treated with dignity and respect. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Principal Collins, you've called me disrespectful. You've labeled me a troublemaker. You've tried to silence me. But what you don't understand is that this fight isn't just about me. It's about every student of color who has ever felt that they don't belong here, who has ever been made to feel inferior. This fight is about making sure no one ever has to feel that way again. There was a brief silence before she continued. You've built a system that punishes us for speaking out. You've built a system that rewards complacency, that allows racism to thrive. But we won't stay silent anymore. We won't let you sweep this under the rug. We are here, and we will be heard. The room was still. For a moment, Jada wasn't sure if anyone would respond. But then, the applause started. Soft at first, and then louder, building until the entire room was clapping. The days that followed were a blur. News outlets picked up her story, and social media was filled with support for Jada. Her voice had become a symbol of resistance, and she knew that what she was doing was starting to make a difference. But the road ahead was still long, and the backlash was relentless. People called her radical. People said she was making things worse. People tried to discredit her every chance they got. But Jada wasn't afraid anymore. She had found her voice, and she would never let anyone take it from her again. The movement she had started wasn't over, it had just begun. As the weeks passed, Jada's strength only seemed to grow. Every new obstacle, every harsh word from the community, only solidified her resolve. The school board, after seeing the public outcry and the mounting pressure, had no choice but to address the situation. They called for an emergency meeting, one that would decide whether or not Jada's expulsion would be overturned. It was a tense night. Jada sat with her mother in the front row, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the decision that was about to be made. Her mother squeezed her hand, offering her a comforting smile. You've done all you can, Jada. No matter what happens, know that you've made a difference. You've changed things, and you've done it with strength and grace. Jada nodded, grateful for her mother's unwavering support. She had learned so much from Denise, about resilience, about standing tall in the face of injustice, about refusing to let the world define her. The meeting began, and one by one the board members voiced their opinions. Most of them were still unwilling to acknowledge the role racism had played in Jada's expulsion. They tried to frame it as a matter of respect and discipline, as if the issue had nothing to do with race. But Jada wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. She stood up, interrupting the flow of the meeting. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "With all due respect, you can continue to call this a matter of respect and discipline, but we all know the truth. The truth is that this is about race. The truth is that I was punished because I spoke out about the inequities in this school. I was punished because I dared to challenge the status quo." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jada continued, "I am not the only one who has faced this. There are students in this school who are invisible, who are dismissed, who are treated like they don't belong. My fight is not just for me, it's for every single one of them. I will not back down." Principal Collins, who had been sitting at the back of the room, shot Jada an icy glare, but she didn't flinch. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late. The room wasn't on his side anymore. After a long and heated discussion, the board voted to overturn Jada's expulsion. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but it didn't matter. Jada had won. The moment the decision was announced, a wave of applause erupted from the crowd. Students, parents, and teachers, those who had supported her, those who had doubted her, were all standing, clapping, and cheering. Jada turned to her mother, tears welling in her eyes. Denise pulled her into a tight embrace. "You did it," her mother whispered. "You've changed the world." It was bittersweet, though. Jada knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just one victory in a much larger battle. The system had been shaken, but it hadn't fallen. There was still much work to be done. In the weeks that followed, Jada became more of a symbol than ever before. The town, once divided by old prejudices, began to shift. People who had never spoken out before were now rallying behind her. But with this newfound support also came new challenges. The backlash from some members of the community was intense. They accused Jada of stirring up trouble and dividing the town. There were even those who tried to discredit her by accusing her of exaggerating her experiences, saying that the school wasn't as racist as she claimed. But Jada didn't let the hate consume her. Instead, she used it as fuel for her fire. She began writing essays, speaking at local events, and using her platform to bring attention to the systemic issues that had been ignored for so long. Her words reached far beyond the town's borders. One evening, as Jada was working on her latest essay, Maya sent her a text. "You've been amazing, Jada, but you've been carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. You don't have to do this alone. We're all in this with you." Jada smiled, wiping away a tear. It was moments like this that reminded her of why she fought. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every student who felt invisible, every person who had been told their voice didn't matter. She replied, "I know, I'm not alone. Thank you for being here, Maya. I couldn't have done it without you." The fight was far from over, but Jada had learned so much in her journey. She had learned that change wasn't easy, but it was possible. She had learned that her voice mattered. And most importantly, she had learned that she could make a difference. One word, one action, one person at a time. Her victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been marginalized, for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had been silenced. Jada had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience and courage, and she would never stop fighting for what was right. The final scene unfolds at Jada's high school graduation. She stands at the podium, looking out at the crowd of students, teachers, and family members. As she begins her speech, there is no fear in her voice, only strength. "Today we celebrate not just our achievements, but our journey," Jada says, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We celebrate the fights we've had to endure, the battles we've fought, and the victories we've claimed, not just for ourselves, but for each other." She pauses, letting her words sink in. But our work isn't over. The fight for justice, for equality, for dignity, this fight belongs to all of us, and it's up to each of us to continue it. We may face challenges, we may face setbacks, but as long as we stand together, as long as we refuse to be silenced, we will win. The room is silent, every person listening to her words. Jada's voice is steady and unwavering, her confidence unshakable. "This is just the beginning," she says with a smile. "Let's keep fighting. Let's keep speaking out. Let's keep pushing for a world where everyone is truly equal." The crowd erupts into applause, a standing ovation for Jada and the change she had sparked. As she steps down from the podium, she looks at her mother, who is beaming with pride. Jada knows that this is only the start of her journey, but she's ready. Ready to continue the fight. Ready to lead the charge for justice, ready to change the world. Jada's journey did not end with her high school graduation. The fight she had started was far from over, and she knew that this victory, though monumental, was just one step in a much longer march toward equality. After graduation, Jada entered the world beyond the walls of her school, a world filled with new challenges but also new opportunities. She was accepted into a prestigious university, a place where her dreams of becoming a lawyer could take root. But even in this new chapter, Jada carried the weight of her experiences with her. She knew that the systems she had battled against in her small town existed on a much larger scale. She had seen firsthand how deeply entrenched racism could be, and she was determined to dismantle it piece by piece. Her first year of college was a whirlwind of new experiences. She was surrounded by students from all over the world, each with their own story to tell. But as much as she tried to immerse herself in her studies, the fight for justice never left her mind. She spent her nights writing, crafting arguments for cases she hoped to one day take on. She joined campus organizations focused on social justice, using her platform to continue speaking out about the issues that mattered most to her. One evening, as she was preparing for a debate on racial equality, Maya called. Her voice was filled with excitement. "Jada, you won't believe this. I'm organizing a rally back home. It's going to be huge. We want to bring more attention to the issues you fought for at that school. Things still haven't changed as much as they should." Jada felt a surge of pride. Even though she was miles away, her fight, her voice, had sparked something much bigger than herself. It was spreading, like a wildfire of hope and resistance. "That's amazing, Maya. You know I'll support you however I can. Just let me know when and where." As the rally approached, Jada realized just how much her story had impacted her community. Students, parents, and even faculty members from her old school reached out, expressing their gratitude for her courage and leadership. People were finally starting to see the cracks in the system, the places where injustice had festered for too long. The rally was held in the heart of the town square, a place where protests and marches had once been unheard of. But as Jada stood at the front watching the crowd grow, she realized how much had changed. There were black students, white students, even teachers, standing together united in their belief that the system had to change. Jada wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where students of all races could walk into school and feel truly seen, truly valued. That night, as she stood before the crowd, Jada spoke with the same fire that had driven her during her high school battle. "This fight isn't over," she said, her voice strong and steady. "But we are stronger now than we've ever been. Together we can build a world where our children won't have to fight the battles we fought, where they can go to school without fear, without being treated differently because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted into applause, a sea of support that made Jada's heart swell with pride. She had become a symbol of resistance, of hope. And as she looked out over the crowd, she realized that the work she had started was just beginning. In the years that followed, Jada's work continued to inspire change on a larger scale. She graduated from college with honors, her law degree in hand, ready to take on the next chapter of her journey. She began working with civil rights organizations, using her legal expertise to fight against racial inequality in the court system. Her story became a rallying cry for others who had been marginalized, a beacon of hope for those who felt they didn't have a voice. But it wasn't just in the courtroom where Jada's influence was felt. She continued to speak out, to organize, to fight for the changes she knew were necessary. Her mother, Denise, had always told her that justice was a long road. But Jada had learned that with every step forward, with every voice raised in protest, they were moving closer to the world they dreamed of. A world where equality wasn't just a hope but a reality. And through it all, Jada remained true to herself. She never lost sight of the values her mother had instilled in her. To stand tall, to fight for what was right, and to never, ever back down in the face of injustice. Her legacy wasn't just one of triumph over adversity. It was a legacy of resilience, empowerment, and the power of community. Jada had shown the world that one voice, no matter how small it seemed, could change the course of history. And she knew, without a doubt, that the fight would continue. Because, in the end, justice was not a destination, but a journey. And she was ready to keep walking it every step of the way. It wasn't long after the rally that Jada's name began to spread beyond her small town. What started as a fight for justice in one high school had blossomed into a national conversation about race, power, and the need for systemic change in schools across the country. News outlets picked up her story, interviews followed, and Jada was invited to speak at conferences, gatherings, and even to lawmakers who were starting to take notice of the wave she had created. At first, Jada wasn't sure if she was ready for this level of attention. She had always been more comfortable speaking to those she knew, her peers, her family, the community she had grown up in. But as the demands grew, Jada realized that this was no longer just about her. It was about all the students who had suffered in silence, about every marginalized voice that had been silenced by systems built to oppress them. One evening, Jada found herself on a stage in front of a national audience at a civil rights convention. The room was filled with people who had fought for justice for decades, activists, lawyers, educators, and young people like her, determined to make change. Jada stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She had been given a platform, and she was determined not to waste it. I stand before you today not as a symbol, not as a spokesperson for a movement. I stand before you as a young woman who was told that her voice didn't matter, Jada began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I stand here because I've learned that no matter how much they try to silence us, no matter how much they try to tell us we don't belong, our voices will always rise, and they will always matter. The room erupted in applause, and Jada felt a deep sense of belonging. She wasn't alone anymore. Her voice had joined the chorus of countless others who had fought before her, and the fight was far from over. The challenges of change, setbacks, and backlash. However, as Jada's voice grew louder, so did the backlash. In every victory, there was an opposing force, those who resisted change, who clung to the status quo. It began with subtle comments. She received letters, messages, and social media posts accusing her of stirring up trouble, of being too radical. Some said she was exaggerating the problem, that racism was a thing of the past and she was just seeking attention. At times, these messages felt like daggers. The more she spoke out, the more enemies she made. One afternoon, Jada sat in her room reading one particularly hurtful message from someone she once considered an ally. The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She felt her resolve beginning to waver, a familiar feeling creeping in. The self-doubt, the wondering if she was really making a difference or if she was just another angry black woman with a voice too loud for some to bear. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Maya. Jada, I know it's hard right now, but you've come too far to turn back. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. You're doing what needs to be done. Jada smiled, wiping away a tear. Maya's words always had a way of grounding her. She was right. The journey had never been easy, and it never would be. But Jada wasn't doing this for the praise or the recognition. She was doing it for those who couldn't speak out, for those who were still struggling in silence. A moment of reflection. The power of family. The pressure was mounting, and Jada often found herself seeking solace in the one constant she had, her mother. Denise had been her rock throughout every stage of this journey, from the moment Jada stood up in that assembly, to the long months of legal battles, to the national spotlight she now found herself in. One evening, Jada sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Jada was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't been home in weeks, her schedule packed with meetings, speeches, and interviews. Mom, Jada said, her voice tired. I'm just so tired. Is this ever going to end? The hate, the fighting, the constant pressure. Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Denise placed her hand on Jada's. Baby, you've always been a fighter. I've watched you grow from that little girl who used to hide behind my skirts when things got tough into a young woman who stands tall even when the world is trying to knock you down. This fight, it's not about you. It's about everyone who has been told they don't matter. It's about the future, Jada. You're laying the groundwork for something bigger than yourself. Jada nodded, a sense of clarity washing over her. Her mother's words were always the anchor she needed. The road ahead might be long and the obstacles would keep coming, but Jada now understood something fundamental. It wasn't about a destination. It was about the journey, and every step she took brought her closer to the change she was determined to see. The next generation. Inspiring future leaders. As the years passed, Jada's influence continued to spread. She mentored younger students, especially those from communities that had faced similar struggles. Through workshops, speeches, and personal guidance, Jada helped guide the next generation of leaders. She would often visit local high schools, where she shared her story and offered advice to those who were ready to take on the fight for justice. One day, a young girl approached Jada after a talk at a high school. "Jada," the girl said, her voice shaking with nervous excitement. "I just wanted to thank you. You've made me realize that my voice matters, that I don't have to stay silent anymore. I want to be a lawyer, just like you." Jada smiled, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Then you go for it. Your voice is powerful and it deserves to be heard." Jada knew that the fight was not over, but seeing the next generation of young leaders stepping up gave her a renewed sense of hope. The cycle of resistance and progress would continue. The work would never stop. But as long as there were voices, like hers, like the girls, fighting for what was right, there was always hope. Years passed and Jada's transformation was undeniable. She had gone from a student who fought to stay in a school that didn't value her to a national figure, an activist, a lawyer, and a voice for the voiceless. But her journey wasn't just about personal success. It was about paving the way for others, showing them that they too could fight against the injustices that had been normalized for so long. Jada had returned to law school after high school, determined to become a lawyer and fight systemic racism from within the legal system. But she quickly realized that the road to true change was even more complicated than she had anticipated. While at law school, Jada faced a new set of challenges. She was often one of the few students of color in her classes, and sometimes she felt that she had to work twice as hard just to be taken seriously. Her professors, who were overwhelmingly white, often overlooked her contributions, and her classmates sometimes questioned her presence as if she had somehow taken a spot from someone more deserving. But Jada had learned over the years to channel these moments of doubt into fuel for her fire. She remembered her mother's words and the lessons from her struggle. This fight was never just about her. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong, every voice that had been silenced for too long. Her moments of self-doubt were real, but they no longer defined her. Instead, she used her experiences to push forward. She sought out mentors, allies, and peers who believed in her cause. She engaged in debates, wrote articles, and gave speeches that challenged the status quo of the legal world. Slowly but surely, she began to make her mark. Raising awareness. A movement rekindled. As Jada entered the final years of law school, the issues of race and justice that had been at the core of her fight began to intensify across the country. Protests, movements, and social media campaigns brought the conversation about racial inequality back to the forefront. Jada found herself back in the spotlight, but this time, it wasn't just for her. She had become a symbol of resilience and change, a living testament to the power of fighting for what's right, no matter the cost. One day, after attending a protest where the crowd demanded justice for victims of police violence, Jada received a call that would change the course of her career. A renowned law firm, known for representing high-profile civil rights cases, reached out to offer her a position. They wanted her to be part of a legal team that would challenge discriminatory practices in the criminal justice system, focusing on racial bias in sentencing and policing. "Jada, we've seen your work, your leadership, and your dedication. We need someone who knows what it's like to be on the front lines of this fight," the voice on the other end of the phone said. Jada's heart raced. This was the opportunity she had dreamed of, but it came with a heavy responsibility. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing the voices of thousands of people who had been wronged, whose lives had been disrupted by the same systems that had once tried to silence her. With the support of her mother, Maya, and countless others who had been with her every step of the way, Jada accepted the offer. She knew that the work would be grueling, but she was ready for it. The fight was far from over, but now she had the tools to make a real, lasting difference. A full circle. The graduation speech. It was the day of Jada's graduation from law school, and as she walked across the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. Her mother, sitting in the front row, smiled proudly, wiping away tears. Jada had overcome so much to get to this moment: racism, personal doubts, and systemic obstacles that tried to keep her from reaching her potential. But here she was, standing tall, not as a victim, but as a victor. That evening, Jada was invited to give the commencement speech. As she took the stage, the weight of the moment settled over her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the collective strength of everyone who had fought with her, who had believed in her, and who had been touched by her journey. Graduates, friends, family, and esteemed faculty, we've all had different journeys to get here today, but one thing unites us: the belief that we can make a difference. Jada began, her voice strong and clear. We've been told time and time again that we don't belong, that our voices don't matter, that we should sit down and be quiet. But let me tell you something. We are here today because we refuse to be silenced. We are here because we believed in justice, in equality, and in the power of our voices to create change. Jada paused, looking out into the crowd, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, many of them her peers who had stood by her throughout the years. I stand before you today not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone who has learned that the fight is never easy. It's never neat. It's messy, painful, and filled with setbacks. But it's worth it, she continued. And to those who are still fighting for justice, for equality, for recognition, keep fighting. Your voice matters. Your story matters, and the world will hear you. As Jada finished her speech, the room erupted in applause once more. Her journey was far from over, but the road ahead was now clearer than ever. She had become not just a survivor, but a leader, and her story would inspire generations to come. Looking ahead, a future of change. Jada's career at the law firm was just the beginning of a larger movement. As she worked tirelessly on cases that challenged racial inequalities, she continued to mentor young activists, speak at rallies, and use her platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. She knew that true change wouldn't come overnight, but she was more than willing to fight for it, one case, one speech, one act of resistance at a time. Her story was no longer just her own. It was the story of countless others who had stood up, fought back, and refused to be erased. Jada had become a symbol of what was possible when you believed in yourself, when you refused to back down, and when you fought for justice not just for you, but for everyone. And in that fight, Jada found her true purpose, empowering others to rise up, to speak out, and to change the world just as she had. Jada's work soon gained national attention. Her advocacy for racial justice, especially in the legal and educational systems, began to spark conversations far beyond the confines of her law firm. Her casework, articles, and speeches were regularly covered in the media. Even with all the acclaim, Jada remained humble. She knew this fight was not about her. This was about the countless others whose lives had been touched by systemic injustice, whose stories had not yet been heard. Her influence began to spread in ways she hadn't imagined. Jada became a sought-after speaker at conferences and rallies, traveling the country to share her experience, her wisdom, and her vision for a better future. Each time she stepped onto a stage, whether in front of a few hundred people or thousands, she felt the weight of the responsibility she carried, but it no longer scared her. Jada's rise wasn't without its challenges, though. As her profile grew, so did the backlash. There were those who accused her of playing the race card or of being divisive, but these voices only fueled her determination. She knew that for every person who criticized her, there were hundreds, no thousands, who understood what she was fighting for. One particularly cold winter evening, after a particularly harsh public critique on a talk show, Jada sat with her mother, Denise, who had always been her guiding light. "They say you're just stirring up problems, that you're dividing people," her mother said, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. "How does that make you feel, baby?" Jada sighed, rubbing her temples. "It hurts, Mom. It really does. I try to explain myself to make people understand that this isn't about making things worse, it's about making things better. But sometimes I wonder if they'll ever get it, if I'm just wasting my time." Denise put a hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me, Jada. The world has always been afraid of people who challenge its norms, but change never comes without discomfort. Remember, you're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for everyone who doesn't have a voice. You're carrying generations of struggle and hope on your back." Jada looked up at her mother, a sense of clarity settling in. "You're right, this isn't about me, it's about justice, it's about change, and I won't stop until I see it." The final showdown, a fight for the future. Years later, Jada's work culminated in a landmark case that would alter the course of her life forever. It wasn't just any case, it was one that would set a precedent for racial equality in schools and other institutions. The case involved the systemic racism embedded in school disciplinary practices, which disproportionately affected students of color, particularly black students like Jada once was. After years of legal battles, countless late nights drafting arguments, and several failed attempts at mediation, Jada stood before the Supreme Court, arguing her case. This wasn't just about her. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for since that day she was expelled from her school all those years ago. This was about ensuring that no student of color would ever have to face the kind of injustice she had endured. As Jada stood before the judges, she didn't just present evidence. She shared her story, the story of a girl who was punished for speaking up, the story of a community that tried to suppress her voice. She spoke not just to the judges but to every student who had been silenced by prejudice, to every parent who had been dismissed by the system, to every person who had ever felt like they didn't matter. "I stand here today," Jada began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "not just as a lawyer but as someone who has lived through the very injustices I'm speaking about. I fought for my voice, I fought for my rights, and I fought for justice. And I stand here now to ask the court to take a stand for the countless students of color who are still being silenced, punished, and marginalized every single day." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Jada knew this was her moment. The battle was long, but the result was clear. Jada won the case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of racial equality and disciplinary actions, forcing schools across the nation to adopt fairer practices. But even as she stood there victorious, Jada knew that this was just another chapter in an ongoing fight. The victory was, Jada stood at the doorway of her room, looking out at the sunlight filtering through the window. It had been weeks since the school board reversed her expulsion, but she still felt like the dust hadn't completely settled. So much had changed, yet at times it felt like nothing at all had. She was back at school, yes, but everything had shifted. "Hey, you okay?" Maya's voice cut through the silence. Jada didn't even hear her come in. Jada turned to face her best friend, who leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed. Maya had always known how to read her, especially now that the weight of their fight had started to show. The exhaustion was evident in Jada's eyes, and despite her victory, there was still a part of her that hadn't fully healed. "I'm trying to be," Jada said softly, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and frustration. "But it's hard, you know? It's like I've won, but I've lost so much along the way." Maya nodded, her eyes understanding but filled with a quiet sadness. "You didn't just fight for yourself, Jada. You fought for everyone who's ever been silenced. That's not easy. You didn't lose anything. You gained the world." Jada smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was true. She had gained the world. Her voice had carried farther than she had ever imagined. She had inspired not just the black students at her school, but others who had watched from the sidelines, too scared to speak up. Her fight had rippled through the community, calling for justice, equality, and the recognition of what was long overdue. Yet as the halls of the school buzzed with whispers of her courage, she couldn't escape the feeling of isolation. The town, while giving her some space, had not fully embraced her message. There were still those who couldn't see beyond the color of her skin, who labeled her trouble or accused her of stirring up unnecessary conflict. "Do you think it was worth it?" Jada asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I mean, people keep asking me, why can't you just let it go, move on?" But moving on means pretending that none of this happened, pretending that it doesn't still matter. Maya's expression softened as she approached her friend, offering a warm, reassuring hug. "Jada, you're changing things even if they don't see it yet. But you're right. It's not going to be easy. You can't move on from something that has been part of your whole life. Jada closed her eyes, holding on to the comfort of her friend's embrace. The path ahead was daunting, but it was hers to walk. She was no longer the girl who had been expelled for speaking out. She was now the girl who had changed a community, who had faced down the system and had come out stronger. "You've already made a difference," Maya said quietly, pulling away from the hug. "Not just for you, but for everyone who has ever felt like they didn't have a voice. You gave them one." Jada thought of her mother. Denise's unwavering strength had always been a reminder of what true resilience looked like. She had never faltered in her belief that change was possible, even when the world around them seemed stuck. Denise had seen something in Jada long before Jada ever realized her own power. Now, standing in front of her mother, Jada could see that belief reflected back in her own eyes. Later that evening, Jada sat in her room, writing in her journal. It was a practice she had turned to throughout this journey, pouring out her heart in words that no one but her would see. Tonight, she wasn't just writing about the pain or the victories. She was writing about the future, a future she could now imagine clearly. She had already started a scholarship fund for Black students, determined to open doors that had been closed to her for so long. It was the first of many steps. It wasn't just about herself anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to walk this path alone. The sound of her mother's voice broke her thoughts. "Jada," Denise called from the kitchen, "come help me with dinner. You're the reason this house is full of celebration tonight." Jada smiled to herself. Closing her journal, as she stood to join her mother, she realized that this journey, this battle, wasn't over. The world still had a long way to go, but she was no longer the girl who stood in the shadows. She was the one leading the way. "I'm coming, Mom," Jada said, her voice full of resolve. "And don't worry, we've only just begun." The following months were a whirlwind for Jada. The victory over Principal Collins had been only the beginning. The decision to reverse her expulsion was met with mixed emotions. There were cheers from some, and stony silence from others. But Jada understood that true change was never easy, especially when it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. By the time graduation day arrived, the air in the school had shifted. The ripple effect of her actions had spread, and though there were still plenty who resented her for what she had exposed, there was a growing respect for the courage it took to stand alone in a system that had long been designed to silence her. Jada walked across the stage, her heart beating steadily in her chest, not with nerves, but with a quiet pride. She had done it. She had fought for her right to speak, to be heard, and to be seen. And in the process, she had taught others how to do the same. When it was her turn to speak, she paused, taking in the sea of faces. Some familiar, some indifferent, some now filled with new understanding. "I stand before you today," Jada began, her voice strong, "not just as a student who overcame adversity, but as someone who believes that our fight for justice is far from over. We've been taught that the world is a place of fairness, that if you work hard enough, you'll get what you deserve. But for many of us, that's not the case. We are often judged by the color of our skin, the shape of our names, the neighborhoods we come from. And for too long, that has shaped how we are treated." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration. "I want to remind you all of something," Jada continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "You have the power to change the world. You have the power to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when the world tells you to sit down and be quiet. I didn't do this alone. I did this with the support of people who believed in me when others didn't. But more importantly, I did it because I believe that every single person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Every single person deserves a voice." There was a beat of silence as Jada's words settled into the room. For a moment, the whole auditorium seemed to hold its breath, and then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't thunderous or overwhelming, but it was genuine. For the first time, Jada could feel the weight of the room shift, as though they were finally seeing her, not just as the girl who caused a stir, but as a young woman with purpose. She stepped down from the stage. Jada caught her mother's gaze in the crowd. Denise's face was filled with pride and love, but there was also a quiet understanding. Jada had come a long way from the girl who had been expelled, and now she was the woman who was changing lives. Later that evening, at the graduation party, Jada sat quietly in the corner with Maya, both of them laughing and talking about the future. Maya had been by her side from the beginning, through the courtrooms and protests, and now she was there, celebrating the triumphs. "I can't believe it's finally over," Maya said, grinning. Jada smiled back. "It's not over, not for me, and not for anyone who's still out there fighting." Maya's grin faltered slightly, but only for a moment. "You're right. There's still work to be done." Jada nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt before. "This was just one battle. I'm not stopping. Here, I've got bigger things planned, things that'll help other kids like me. The scholarship fund is just the start. I want to create a space where every student feels seen and heard. No more silence." Maya looked at her in awe. "You're gonna change the world, Jada." Jada's eyes shone with determination, and, for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. But it wasn't a burden. It was a calling. "And I'm just getting started," Jada said, her voice steady and full of resolve. As the night wore on and the sounds of celebration faded, Jada knew that her story wasn't finished. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would continue to fight for justice, empower others, and never back down from what was right.